Welcome, welcome. So we're going to go ahead and kick off 2023 CEP conference. Thank you, Grace Nicolette, Phil Buchanan, and the entire Center for Effective Philanthropy, or CEP team, for inviting me and Philanthropy Massachusetts to share just a few words of welcome to all of you. So welcome to Boston, and thanks for joining us. All right. I'm Alex McCrae, and currently, alongside my colleague Jessica Burns, serve as Interim Co-Executive Director at Philanthropy Massachusetts, a 54-year-old nonprofit membership organization. I also serve as the Vice President of Member Engagement and Strategic Initiatives here at Philanthropy Massachusetts. It's really an honor for me to be here and to open up CEP's conference, as I'm a huge fan of CEP, and we partnered with them for many, many years, and I'm really just honored, and really it's a pleasure to be here and with you and to kick off the conference. For those of you who may not be as familiar with Philanthropy Massachusetts, or a little less familiar, as I mentioned, we're a 54-year-old membership organization comprised of approximately 150 or so institutional funder members, including philanthropic advisors and individual donors, as well as 360 active nonprofit members. So we, as a philanthropy serving organization, or PSO, sit in a pretty unique space between funders and nonprofits, those with resources and those seeking those resources, financial and otherwise. We recognize and understand the role that we play as a PSO and are honored to serve that, right? So not only to serve, but also to lead, to convene, to connect you to each other. Some of the other things we do, we support about a dozen or so funder networks across role, staff role, identity, geography throughout the Commonwealth, and across issue areas. So if you're living, working, playing, operating in the state, we likely have some program of the 140 or so that we host every year that speaks to you. And on the nonprofit side, we strengthen smaller nonprofit organizations, boosting their capacity to be better. And we focus on fund development on that space, in that arena. When thinking about my remarks, three things came to mind. One, identify your why. Why are you interested? Why are you engaged in this work, in this field? What drives you? For me, I can't help be attracted to the field in a number of ways. One, helping to improve outcomes for those who look and self-identify similarly to me is really important to me. That's a reason, not the only, but a reason why I'm driven to stay in this field, even with its challenges, right? It's complex, it's intricate, it can be tiring and exhausting, and there are many opportunities for growth, development, evolution, and positive action. Two, be mindful. So over the next few days throughout the conference, I encourage you all to just pay attention to what your body, your mind, and your heart are hearing and experiencing, right? What are you open to? What are you learning? What are you less open to or less receptive to? Explore that. And then third, set a goal for yourself. This is one of my favorite ones. So think about the world that you want, if you're a parent, your kids to grow up in and thrive in. If you're not a parent, think about those who will come after you, because at some point, we won't be here, right? That's a fact. We won't be here. What is the kind of world that you want to leave behind? So set a goal for yourself to take back one concrete thing that you plan to do to help shift the world to be that world, better than the one that you inhabited or inherited and the one that we're currently living in. So again, I encourage each of you to identify your why, be mindful and pay attention. And C, set a goal for yourself to take back something concrete and actionable. Thank you again for the opportunity to just share a few words from Philanthropy Massachusetts' perspective and mine. And with that, I'll turn things over to Grace.
Thank you so much, Alex. We are so grateful for the partnership with Philanthropy Massachusetts for this event. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Boston. My name is Grace Nicolette. I'm the Vice President of Programming and External Relations here at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And on behalf of the CEP staff, I take great pride in welcoming you to CEP's 2023 conference. Thank you for joining over 500 fellow foundation leaders, trustees, major donors, and sector leaders from all over the United States and the world to engage in some of the most pressing issues and topics in our field today. Between now and the end of our time on Wednesday, we've designed an engaging program for you with the hope that we can create a unique environment where great ideas and best practices can be shared. We're so grateful to all of you who've contributed your ideas and expertise in shaping what we're going to experience together. Pursuing a stronger and more effective philanthropic sector has become simultaneously more challenging and more important in our current moment. We hope you'll come away with both a better bird's eye view of our sector, as well as more detailed insight on a range of really big issues. I want to acknowledge what a difficult moment this is. With multiple wars globally, horrific terrorism, hate and injustice here and around the world, and many other very serious domestic and international challenges. We hope this time together helps us reflect on how we can effectively pursue crucial philanthropic goals and helps you feel empowered to do everything you can to make a positive difference. At this event, you're going to hear a range of perspectives, which we hope you'll find challenging, will sharpen, and ultimately support your own thinking. Our hope in bringing us together is that we can have honest, kind, and respectful and generative conversations on issues that matter to our work, and given philanthropy's important role, our world. So I ask you to say what you think, to listen generously, and to assume the best in others. There are many foundations and people that I wish to thank that have helped to make this conference possible. I want to give a special thanks to our top conference sponsors, the Barr Foundation, the Klarman Family Foundation, an Anonymous Foundation, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, the Johnson Scholarship Fund, Nellie Mae Education Foundation, Wagner Foundation, and the Walton Family Foundation, and many others whom we also thank for their generous support. The full list of our conference sponsors can be found on our conference app or at CEP2023.org. In addition to receiving conference support, we also receive grant support from many funders, including the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and all of our funders are listed on our website at CEP.org. This vital support allows us to do our work, bringing data and insight to bear on the field of philanthropy. This is a particularly exciting time for us at CEP. Over the last few years, we've grown and expanded to 65 staff in our 2 offices in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in San Francisco. On the research front, we've welcomed a new Vice President of Research, Elisha Arrillaga, in June, whom you'll be hearing from shortly with an exclusive preview. Yes. She's going to be sharing an exclusive preview of findings from year 2 of our study of the impact of MacKenzie Scott's giving. Elisha is building on and building out an exciting research agenda for CEP going forward, which will bring even more insights on the state of our field, what nonprofits need, and best practices grounded in evidence. With CEP's assessment tools for foundations, led by my colleague Kevin Baldick, we now have delivered 950 grantee perception reports to funders around the world since our founding, and 177 donor perception reports for community foundations in the US and in Canada, which measures donor satisfaction and engagement, and over 150 staff perception reports, allowing funders to gather important feedback from their staff. Our custom advisory work has also grown by leaps and bounds, with now nearly 300 engagements completed. New to CEP this year is the launch of our CEP Learning Institute, led by my colleague Amber Bradley, which is bringing forth a suite of both custom and set cohort learning opportunities for funders. And last but not least, our Youth Truth Initiative, led by our colleague Jen Vorswilka, which gathers important feedback for funders and other education leaders from youth, has now expanded to 39 states, having surveyed over 2.6 million students and nearly 600,000 family members, bringing their voices into the important rooms where decisions are made. You're going to hear more about the exciting work my colleagues are working on, both at CEP and Youth Truth, in a few of the breakout sessions that my colleagues are leading. I want to now acknowledge CEP's Board of Directors, which provides such crucial strategic guidance and governance to this organization. If you're a member of CEP's board, do you mind standing, please? Thank you. I also want to thank and acknowledge our CEP Advisory Board, which helps guide us on vital decisions. Could you please stand? Thank you. So before we dive into the rest of our agenda, let me briefly cover a few housekeeping items. CEP staff members at this conference are wearing yellow lanyards, so please feel free to ask us if you need help with anything. I'm also so grateful to each member of the CEP staff for making this event possible. So my colleagues, could you mind standing, please? Thank you. Each of you should have received the Wi-Fi info on the back of your name tag, or it's on the screen up there and around the hotel. We welcome and encourage you to join in the conversation about what you hear and experience on LinkedIn and Instagram using the hashtag CEP2023. And finally, let's make sure all of our phone ringers are silent. Now, I'm pleased to welcome to the stage CEP's board chair, Tiffany Gueye, who will be introducing and moderating the first session of our conference, as well as the speakers and panelists for that session. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much, Grace, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to introduce to you all a great panel to kick off our conference this year. We have with us Lysa Ratliff, the CEO of Kaboom, a nonprofit focused on uniting with communities to build kid-designed play spaces that spark joy and foster a sense of belonging for kids who are often denied opportunities to thrive. We also have Jamie Allison. She's the executive director of the Walter and Elise Haas Fund based in San Francisco. The fund focuses on providing access and opportunity to foster a more just and vibrant community, and funds in the arts, economic well-being, Jewish life, and racial justice. We're joined by Elisha Arrillaga. She's CEP's Vice President for Research. She joined the organization just earlier this year after working as a faculty fellow and professor of practice in philanthropy and education policy at the University of Texas. And finally, of course, I'll introduce to you all somebody who's hopefully not a stranger, Phil Buchanan, our incredible CEO here at CEP. So we have a great panel presentation that's going to start with a preview of some research. The plenary here is focused on what can be learned from the experiences of nonprofits that were recipients of MacKenzie Scott's very large philanthropic gifts over the last few years. So we're going to start with a preview of the newest research from Phil and Elisha, and then we're going to hear from our panelists and finally open it up to any of you that might have questions. Phil?
Thank you. Thanks, Tiffany. I tempted to ask for the lights to be up a little bit higher because it's so great to see people after so long. This is the first time we've been together in person at a CEP conference since 2019. And yeah, it just feels really good to be together. So at that conference in Minneapolis, was anyone there? Anyone remember that conference? Okay. So it was fun. And I don't know if people remember, but we were like deep into this examination of like the critique of philanthropy as some kind of ruse to prop up a rigged system. And, you know, like I hear it, and it's really important to engage those systemic critiques. But at CEP, I think that we have really believed that nonprofits at their best, or maybe the best nonprofits, I don't know how you want to say it, are unriggers. They're fighting for opportunity, for equity, that those are the organizations that we're hoping that funders can support to be more effective. They're meeting immediate needs, but they're also thinking about the conditions that create those needs, and they're trying to change them. Again, on all the important issues. I was in Texas a couple weeks ago visiting some nonprofit senior centers in San Antonio and rural Bandera County, population 21,000, with my friend Ramsey Alwyn, who runs National Council on Aging. He's a great leader. I don't know if she's here right now, but she will be here. And I was so struck in that time in Texas by what I'm always struck by every time I visit organizations like those that are doing such crucial work with vital support from individual and institutional donors. I mean, the stories they told about the way they adapted during the pandemic, becoming vaccine centers, delivering multiple times the number of meals to people who needed to be fed that they typically did. But by what they continue to do each day, mobilizing volunteers to drive 80 miles to deliver meals to the homebound in rural Texas, offering comfort and care, and again, seeking to move upstream, advocating for systemic changes that would benefit their communities. I don't know about you all, but for me, for a moment in 2020, for a moment, it felt like we all got it, like we all appreciated these organizations, often local and small. They were the ones who were trusted by their communities, who were doing incredible, heroic work under the most challenging circumstances. Whether in urban neighborhoods or rural communities. And then the racial justice reckoning following the murder of George Floyd opened the eyes of individual, corporate, institutional, community foundation donors to a whole nother set of organizations. Those fighting for criminal justice reform and for racial equity more broadly. Bail funds, organizations like the Equal Justice Initiative, whose amazing founder, Brian Stevenson, had spoken at CEP's last Boston conference in 2017. Organizations seeking to dismantle unjust systems. In that spring and early summer of 2020, the question was, how would funders, foundations, individual donors, respond to support these crucial organizations? Would they rethink their standard operating procedures? Would they engage more deeply to confront systemic inequities? And I don't think anyone was really sure what the answer was going to be. And we tracked the fact that funders did step up. We saw it in terms of giving level, higher giving levels in 2020 than anyone had anticipated because foundations stepped up their giving. We tracked the shifts in process as funders streamlined processes and made more general operating support grants than they had previously. We saw really meaningful shifts, and at least when it comes to the streamlining of processes and the provision of unrestricted support, those shifts have persisted even as the sense of acute crisis has diminished. So amid all of this talk about how philanthropy should change, how it could change, and amid what was actually more change, and again, we documented it, as you can see in those reports, funders did revisit their standard operating procedures. They did do things differently. And that was so vital, right? That made such a difference. And then a new player entered the scene in 2020. You know who I'm talking about. MacKenzie Scott's massive, often unexpected, usually totally unrestricted gifts to nonprofits created quite a stir, and we all watched with interest. In May of 2021, I myself got the mysterious email followed by a phone call in which I was informed of a large unrestricted gift to CEP. In that moment, I reverted to some childlike version of myself, repeating nonsensically the phrase, for real, for real, for real, to the person on the other end of the phone. On a hastily called board of directors Zoom meeting, by the way, if you're gonna hastily call a meeting of your board of directors, you should tell them it's good news, because they all assumed it wasn't. Several CEP board members noted that this was maybe the most interesting natural experiment in contemporary philanthropy, and that we should study it and see what happens. And we worried, well, are we conflicted? We just got this big grant, but then it's like, no, this was a one-time grant. And so nobody would really believe that we were gonna pull our punches, right? Like, why would we? And so we set out to answer some questions. And MacKenzie Scott and her advisors have had no input or influence on what we're sharing today. And there were a bunch of questions on our mind, and Elisha will talk about them. But like, would this be, as some suggested, the ultimate demonstration of a trust-based approach that would yield great results for organizations doing important work, often focused on equity? Or would it be, as many others predicted, an unmitigated train wreck, leading to unintended negative consequences from the much feared financial cliff to other funders pulling back? The goal in studying these gifts was not, of course, to suggest that every one of you should operate just like MacKenzie Scott, even if you could, or for that matter, that you shouldn't, but it was to see what could we all learn from this interesting experiment. We're in year 2 now and are excited to be able to preview here for the first time the latest from the latest round of data collection. My hope is that what we learn here can lead us all to think about what we can take away, no matter the level your organization is funding or how you approach it. And this feels really important right now in a time of intense debate about how and when to trust, and the odd twin realities of declining public trust in nonprofits, broad public trust, even as trust among donors who know nonprofits best seems to be increasing. About how to evaluate and learn from results, and about how to most effectively pursue equity, including racial equity, in a time of orchestrated backlash and in the wake of the US Supreme Court's decision overturning affirmative action in college admissions. So given that the stakes are so high, it matters how philanthropy is done. And when I talk about the stakes being high, I'm talking about all the things. The reality of climate change, threats to our democracy, global wars, terrorism, persistent and profound racial wealth gaps, other kinds of inequality. We're in tough times. And so how philanthropy is practiced that seeks to influence those issues, again, it matters. So I'm thrilled now to turn to my colleague who you've already heard introduced, Dr. Elisha Smith-Arrillaga, to share our latest findings. But as I do that, and before I do that, I just also want to thank the other members of the research team that worked on this study. Dr. Elie Buteau, who has led this project day to day since we launched it in early 2022, Christina M., and Emily Yang. Elisha, take it away, and I think now the slides are more or less queued up for you.
Thanks so much, Phil. I am thrilled to be joining you today to share, hot off the press, for the first time, the findings from this year's data. We also want to thank the many nonprofit and foundation leaders who participated in the interviews and the surveys. Thank you for sharing your opinions and your thoughts and experiences. And we also would love to thank all the funders who supported this great work. Here we go. what we've all been waiting for. So, how is MacKenzie Scott's approach? How is it different from other grant makers? Well, when we see other grant makers here, we're referring to over 10 years of grantee perception report data. That's thousands of nonprofits across the country. And what we see from that data, and when we compare it to the gifts that MacKenzie Scott has made, there are 4 key differences. Scott's gifts are larger, they're unrestricted with few to no grant terms, there are few to no application or reporting requirements, and most surprisingly, there is no time limit in which the gifts must be spent. Now, given what we know about Scott's approach and how different it is, how did we at CEP design this year's study to further learn about any changes for grantees and more about the experiences of new grantees? Well, in addition to adding all the new organizations to the sample that had received gifts from Scott, we added a component to dive more deeply into funder perspectives on Scott's giving as well. Specifically, the 37 funders that we interviewed include 26 private foundations, 7 United Ways, and 4 community foundations. And based on an analysis of this data, I'm excited to share with you today 4 key main findings. Now, before I do, just a note that our findings should, of course, as with any research, be viewed in the context of the moment the data were collected, which is just 1 to 3 years after receipt of this gift. And even with this in mind, this research, to our knowledge, remains the most comprehensive accounting of Scott's giving and its impact. So, takeaway 1 from the data. Nonprofit leaders describe expanding and improving programs to pursue opportunities often related to equity, resulting in what they see as demonstrable impact. This quote illustrates a lot of what we were hearing from nonprofit leaders in these interviews. We developed an entrepreneurial leadership camp for Black and brown business owners, or those who are budding entrepreneurs. We're now in our 3rd year, which was going to be it for us, because that was the extent of the grant dollars. But we received additional grant dollars and additional media attention, and it's been very successful. We see here in the quantitative data that it also supports this theme. Here we see that leaders reported they were able to use the grant to strengthen their organization's ability to achieve their mission, to innovate or take risks, and to serve communities. And the expanding and improving of programming that was happening in organizations was often in support of equity. Almost all leaders, 90% of those we surveyed, report their organizations use some of the grant money to advance equity. And 2/3 of organizations use some of the grant money to advance racial equity specifically. And leaders of color were slightly more likely to report that Scott's grant has or will significantly strengthen the communities in which their organizations seek to have impact. Overall, it's important to note that in this first key finding, we see that leaders of organizations that received a gift from Scott often cited the lack of restriction on when and how the money should be used as creating an opportunity to innovate on their missions in ways not previously possible. Many leaders reflected on how the unrestricted nature of the gift allowed organizations to think creatively and to create programs based on the needs of their clients. Now, key finding 2. Nonprofit leaders describe using Scott's grants to strengthen their organization's capacity and staff climate, translating into better support for the communities that their organizations serve. Almost every interviewee discussed the impact of Scott's grant on their staff. The decisions nonprofits made regarding how to use funds are resulting in what leaders describe as changes in their culture and the daily experiences of their staff. Specifically, leaders report improved staff morale, increased creativity, and an increased focus on equity internally. and in their programmatic work. One leader noted, "It gave us an opportunity to dream." In interviews, 2/3 of leaders of color reported the grant gave them greater courage in their decision-making and further motivated them to advocate for those with shared backgrounds. This quote illustrates many of the stories that we were hearing in these interviews. We were on that path to begin with, but we knew we needed to have our own house in order. If we're going to talk about equity in pay and women's empowerment, we did an internal assessment to make sure that we were actually walking our talk. Many nonprofit leaders that were interviewed also described a wide range of internal equity efforts, including benchmark analyses of compensation, creating a full-blown equity and inclusion committee, and promotion of more people of color to the leadership team. Establishing or upholding pay equity surfaced continually as a priority in interviews. Now, our third key finding, that reactions from funders are more mixed. Although they generally express positive opinions about Scott's giving, many also express concerns about the ability of nonprofits to handle large, unrestricted gifts. The majority of funders, we see here 70%, report their thinking had been influenced by Scott. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing from funders about how Scott influenced them. The conversations that have been happening through trust-based philanthropy, the pledge that the Ford Foundation led, as well as MacKenzie Scott's gifts, have definitely been influencing the conversations we have at the foundation. I'd also say that the pandemic was the catalyst. We also see that funders praise Scott's approach itself. Over 80% of funders in interviews mention positive thoughts about Scott's giving. However, there were also many concerns expressed by funders about Scott's approach. More than 3/4 of interview funders voiced concerns about nonprofits receiving these types of grants. Some of the main concerns voiced were that nonprofits who shared some of the characteristics that we see listed here, such as being smaller or having newer or younger leaders, would be less well-positioned to handle large unrestricted gifts. Some funders, like the one illustrated here, voiced concerns that nonprofits receiving unrestricted gifts might have difficulty in understanding the complexity of how to use that large of an infusion of cash. When nonprofits get additional funding like this, it requires that they scale up internal operations and infrastructure in ways that some CEOs or executive directors and boards just weren't built to handle. We also heard from funders that there were some concerns about Scott's approach itself. So about 1/4 of funders interviewed mentioned concerns about each of the topics we see listed here. Some spoke of concerns about the lack of transparency in her process. Others perceived that organizations who have received a gift from Scott might be less likely to get funding from other organizations because of a perceived lack of need. However, the data from experiences of nonprofits stands in stark contrast to many of the concerns from funders. As we see here in key finding 4, in fact, few nonprofits report unintended or negative consequences. The concerns funders expressed about nonprofits' ability to handle Scott's large grants are not reflected in the survey and interview data we collected from nonprofit leaders. Less than 2% of survey respondents, that's 11 nonprofits, report having encountered a major challenge related to the receipt of or use of their grant funds. In fact, most nonprofit leaders pointed to many benefits to their fundraising efforts from having received a gift from Scott. Almost 90% changed their approach to fundraising after receiving the grant, and most frequently by using the grant as evidence of their organization's credibility. In fact, about half of survey respondents report the grant has actually made fundraising easier. Over 40% of nonprofit leaders describe an increase in the amount of the organization's budget coming from unrestricted grants from foundations or other individual donors. This quote illustrates how some organizations describe fundraising became easier. We were concerned. Was this money going to deter other funders from feeling the need to fund us? And we have not really found that to be the case at all. In fact, it has given us greater standing amongst the funding community. Our funding from other funders continues to be quite strong. We also see that most organizations who receive funding from Scott are not experiencing changes in their funding. 80% report that none of their foundation or individual donors have explicitly told them they are changing the funding provided because of Scott's gift. So MacKenzie Scott's giving to date has broken the mold of typical approaches to philanthropy, even among mega donors and large foundations. While no single element of her giving is entirely new, she has put the elements together in a way that is unprecedented, making gifts that are many times the norm in terms of size, totally unrestricted with respect to use and time constraint for expenditure, and virtually free of any reporting requirements. While this approach is likely to remain unusual and would not be right for every donor, it offers opportunities for research and for learning that can inform donors at various levels, undertaking a range of different approaches. So far, the data that we have gathered over the last 2 years suggests that Scott's giving continues to have profound effects on recipient organizations, and that the fears many other funders express, whether about nonprofits' ability to handle grants of this size or unintended consequences, have not materialized. I'm excited for today's panel to dig more into some of these findings and raise some important questions based on what we've learned. We also hope you will download the full report, which will be released on November 28th, and we hope you will join us for the webinar on the results on November 30th. Thank you so much. Tiffany.
Thanks, Elisha. So we're going to hear some reactions from the panel, and we'll ultimately come to the audience to see if you have any questions. And to start, Lysa, it'd be great to hear, to what extent does this research resonate with your experience as a nonprofit leader? So what did the MacKenzie Scott gift mean to Kaboom? And if you don't mind, please start by giving us the context of the timing and size of the Scott gift to your organization and what your budget size was at the time.
Well, I have to start with a thank you. When I first talked to Phil a couple of years ago, we met each other through a healthy debate about MacKenzie Scott's giving, and I was so grateful that there was an environment to have conversations like this. And I encourage everyone to read this report because it is so full of richness and lifts up exactly the kind of conversations we need to be having. So thank you for making the commitment to do the 3-year study and for creating conversations like this. When we got the MacKenzie Scott gift, so rewind our minds back to coming out of the pandemic. So it was just after 2020. I work at a nonprofit. I lead a nonprofit called Kaboom, but I'm very similar to a lot of my peers who are leading other nonprofits. I completely identified with a lot of the data in the study. So coming out of the pandemic, we build public space, and so our work was stalled. And we were innovating and adapting and trying to figure out, okay, how do we still make sure that we have places for our kids? And I was also a new leader. I had been at the organization for 5 years, but I had become CEO in 2020, right after the pandemic started. So all my hopes and dreams coming to life right in the middle of a pandemic, which was a nice challenge. And in November of 2021, I got a call from a mysterious call, very similar to a lot of my peers, to let me know that we were going to receive this gift. In 2019, we had been about a $30 million organization, and we had been trudging along and doing great work. And then in 2020, because public spaces were shut down, we dropped to about a $12.5 million organization, which was incredibly significant and a very tough challenge and tough for people. In 2021, when we received the gift, we had started to inch back up, and we were at about 13 million minus the grant. So in 2021, when I got the call, I had the option to book all of the gift that year or to spread it out over multi-years. And so we booked the gift that year, but outside of the MacKenzie Scott giving, we had been about $13 million. Fast forward to today, we're right at about $23 million. And I'll get into it later, but there's a more important story underneath that. But we had been right in the middle of looking at staff reductions, and not because we were unhealthy. We had a lot of reserves. We had behaved very responsibly for years and years before that, but because public space was closed and kids couldn't use play spaces, and we wanted to be conservative with our resources for the future so that we would survive the pandemic. And so all of this was happening right in the moment that we got the call around this gift.
And what difference did it make for your organization?
Huge. Everything. I could spend the whole 3 days talking about it. Everything and everywhere. I've talked about this before. We had been on a journey. We were 28 years old, so at the time we were probably about 25 years old. And we had, for most of our history, had 98, 99% of our funding coming from corporations. And so for those who don't know Kaboom, we're a nonprofit. We bring communities together to tell us what they want to see in their space for kids. They design it, we build it. So we're building play infrastructure. But we had, and volunteers come out to do it. So we had spent most of our history with 98% of our funding coming from corporate partners who wanted to come out and volunteer and do this extraordinary work that was transformative to the people who would have access to that park. However, it was a very unhealthy way for an organization to operate, to be reliant on one source of funding like that. And so we had been doing a lot of work thinking about how do we become a healthier organization? How do we diversify? How do we make sure that we're bringing resources in from other areas? And yet we were trapped because we didn't have the resources to invest in taking the risk to build out our measurement and evaluation capabilities, to build out our government affairs work, to build out all of the other bodies of work that needed to get done beyond building one playground at a time. And so it gave us permission to take that leap.
Would you mind telling us what size gift you got?
Oh, $14 million. $14
million.
Yes. Yep, $14 million, which is, yeah. Yeah. It was fantastic.
Great. Yeah. And so it had those impacts on you, on your organization. You were a new CEO. You're also a leader of color. And we know from research that's emerged recently, leaders of color don't get gifts that large. And what did it mean for you as a leader, personally?
It meant a lot. This is where I get very vulnerable and a little bit emotional because, I had spent a long time very ambitious, plotting out where do I want to go, what do I want to do, how do I want to use my life better, and here it was. And yet we were looking at staff reductions, and we were looking at how are we going to adapt, how are we going to innovate, and everybody was looking at me for answers. And though I had them in my head, in my heart, it was very difficult to lead an organization with so much unpredictability. And so it was tense. Like it was just every single day was, okay, what are we going to do? These people are looking at me, trusting, hoping, all of the things. And it was like just the biggest moment of relief because two things. One, having someone believe in our organization the way that she believed in our organization helped us to sit up taller. But it also, I knew where we had to go, and we couldn't go there. And so kind of leading in a conservative way in a time where we had to be more aggressive, it allowed me to be brave enough to say, here it is, we're gonna change all of these things, because that's what's necessary to have the kind of impact we need to have. And so it emboldened me, and it also just like released a lot of stress, a lot of stress.
Yeah. We were in different boats, each of us, but we were all in that same storm, so I can imagine that sense of relief. Thank you. We're going to come back to you for more. Jamie, you lead a foundation. Now, most foundations can't give at this level and aren't intending to, and yet there are still some relevant lessons here about for donors that want to move in the direction of larger gifts and more unrestricted gifts. And you've recently led your foundation through a new effort in this regard. Can you tell us about what you've done, what the change has been?
I'm happy to. First, I just want to say hi, everybody. It's good to almost see you. And since being here, I've already had the pleasure of seeing lots of old friends. It's so good to get to connect, and I look forward to making more connections while I'm here. Really appreciated getting to hear about the research and then to get to hear your first-person account, because the research that you've shared and the first-person account that you've just shared in many ways is part of the hypothesis we were working from at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund. So the Walter and Elise Haas Fund is a 70-year-old family foundation located in the San Francisco Bay Area. We are 10 staff. Our average grant making each year is somewhere between $12 and $13 million annually. And for the last 10 plus years, probably longer, our average grant size has been less than $50,000. I tell you all of that to say, you know, you open by saying like, oh, most foundations are never going to do this kind of giving. I say all this to say, like, we're a relatively small to mid-sized family foundation that has completely changed its approach to grant making. We were welcomed by Alex McCrae, who invited us to think about our why, and part of our why is that we recognize at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund that our nonprofit partners are our most valuable players, and that our work has to be done in partnership with them. And so to think about what it meant to honor our most valuable players, we started to ask ourselves a lot of questions about how we do our work, which Phil also alluded to in his opening remarks. And so when we look at our community, when we look at the scale of suffering, of inequities, but also the resilience and the possibility and the potential, we asked ourselves, like, how can we be the best grant maker, the best change enabler possible? And so our shorthand answer to that question became, we want to fund our nonprofit partners to win. We want them to win for their missions, and we want to fund the possibility of triumph. And so when we started to look at the characteristics of our grant-making approaches and the consequences related to the way we did our grant-making, we recognized that, maybe sometimes we are the barriers to progress. When we look at project support grant versus general operating support grant, when we look at the size of our grants, when we look at the amount of administrative burden related to our grant making, how can we expect our grantee partners, our most valuable players, to do their best work if we are doing things that likely hinder them to do that? And so we coined what internally we refer to as 3 aspirational shifts in our grant-making approach. And I'm happy to meet in hallways and talk to you more about what each of these mean, but the 3 shifts that we settled on was the first one that we really wanted to move from silos to integration, recognizing that we didn't want to box our grantee partners or ourselves into the limits of discrete program areas that were not connected to each other. The second one is that we decided that we needed to move from making contributions to commitments, and that for us, that meant making longer-term multi-year grants and making larger grants, that the contribution of like a small annual grant really wasn't enough. And we joke internally to say that we're not going to be able to impact change in $12 increments. And then finally, we said we really wanted to move from symptoms to system solutions. And for us, that really means that our grant-making portfolio has to include a combination of direct service as well as policy grants. And so when we take all of this together, what that meant is that it created an opportunity for staff and trustees to co-design something we call the Endeavor Fund. And the Endeavor Fund provides 7-year grants at $500,000 a year, so a total of $3.5 million for each organization, with the goal of closing the racial and gender wealth gap. This is the largest, investment that the foundation has ever made in a set of grantees, and we're really proud of the work that we did to get there. And our hope is that for the grantees that are part of the Endeavor Fund, that they will see similar results to what Elisha just shared. And we're already starting to see some of that impact already in terms of overall sustainability, investment in staff and culture of the organization, and the ability to dream bigger and to lead with more courage.
So to summarize, it sounds like you were giving historically for many years successfully and with probably a lot of pride and a lot of impact, grants that were on average 1 year, on average $50,000, and you went to $3.5 million 7-year grants, at least through this Endeavor Fund, not all of your grant making. That's a huge shift. Can you tell us about what the lift was to get there?
So, I mean, you can imagine, like, it took a lot of work to move from, a foundation that, historically has made much smaller grants, made a lot of project support grants as opposed to general operating support grants. But again, when you think about your why and when you think about the who, the responses to how you need to change start to reveal themselves. And so we went on a learning journey at the Walter and Elise Haas Fund that was shared by staff and board. And I've worked in philanthropy for a long time, over 20 years at this point, and we have a myth in our field, right, that staff is creative and bold and forward-thinking, and that our trustees say, no, you can't do those things. And I'm not saying that every foundation is the same, and not every staff, complement is the same, and not all trustees is the same. But what we recognized is that we couldn't, as staff, walk into a boardroom one day after trustees have been accustomed to over a 70-year history, and many of our trustees have been there for a long time, and say, oh, I know we've been making these $15,000, $20,000 grants, and now we want to make $500,000 grants. Of course, the answer to that was going to be no if we just walked in and said that out of the blue. But instead, we made a concerted effort to change the tenor of our board meetings to be less about grant-by-grant transactions, which is a lot of what would happen in our board meetings, but instead to convert every board meeting to what we call a learning meeting. And so instead of transactions, we were focused on learning together, asking each other questions, having folks from the community and other experts to come and talk to us about the reality of the lived experience in community, the reality of nonprofit leadership, relied heavily on probably many of those reports that we didn't get to see the pictures of the slides from the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And as we were on that shared journey together, the engagement between trustees and staff really changed. And the kinds of questions trustees had for us were also much different. And it created an opportunity that by the time staff and the board had been talking about, it didn't have a name at the time, like what it would mean, again, for us to fund our nonprofit partners to win, and increasingly got to the place that we knew that part of the answer was trust-based philanthropy. We knew that part of the answer was multi-year support. We knew that part of the answer was substantive grants. We also knew that part of the answer was really developing a North Star, and for Endeavor Fund, that North Star is closing the racial and gender wealth gap. And so we scheduled these meetings where it was about the engagement and about the shared learning, not about making a decision. And so by the time staff was ready to make a recommendation to staff, for them it was, it was like a no-brainer. They were like, oh, we haven't done this already? We didn't launch already? Like, let's go, green light. And so I really recommend for all of you who are thinking about making bold changes to your grant making and you're not sure if your trustees are ready, to remember that they want to learn and grow too, and figure out how you can create a cadence of learning that helps move the entire board staff team to a place where everyone feels ownership of the new way that your foundation can work for creating more impact in the community.
That's really Fantastic. It's such a great model, and you could probably write a manual, and I'm sure lots of folks will have questions for you throughout. It's really great to have your voice on the panel because it's a nice model of moving toward your values and it being hard, but not impossible, and so that's great. And you talked about trust, and we'll definitely come back to that topic in a second.
May I say just one other thing? There was a slide that Elisha had up where you talked about funder concerns, and it listed things about, oh, can a nonprofit really handle this influx of cash? And when I first saw it, like there was a little piece of me that was like, oh, this is so painful to hear foundation leaders think about their nonprofit partners in this way. But I also want to say that part of that learning journey that happened with trustees before staff ever made like the final recommendation for Endeavor Fund is that my trustees had questions like that. And we didn't judge them for those questions. We simply talked through like, why might you think that? Let's give you lots of examples of how that might not be the case, and we were able to work through that together. And so I'd also just like to say that yes, it was really hard. Lots of questions came up that sometimes made staff feel like, oh, trustees don't get it, but we were also really consistent in providing, again, the container for learning so that trustees could ask those questions without being judged by the staff, and we could engage in those questions together and arrive at a new place together.
Great, great. And in the spirit of learning, to be clear, Lysa, if a funder had another multi-million dollar multi-year gift to give you, can you absorb it?
Oh, I can tell you exactly what we'll do with $500 million.
Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah,
all right.
just
So to be clear. Okay.
Yes.
Bust that myth.
Yeah,
all right.
yeah.
Alicia.
Thank you.
In your professional history, you've also been the leader of a nonprofit that's had to fundraise, and now you've dug into year 2 of the data. You're teeing up year 3 questions. Did anything in this research surprise you, or was it about what you would have expected?
You know, Tiffany, I would say that most of the findings were very much in line with my own personal experience. And there's one finding, there are actually many, but as I said before, on November 28th, you can see all of them. But there's one that I didn't share today that I'll mention now, and that's that more than 50% of nonprofit leaders that were surveyed talked about the ability to collaborate more with these funds. And that is something that really resonated with my own personal experience. I led a statewide education advocacy organization, Education Trust West, for several years. And part of what was so powerful about receiving, one of the gifts we received actually from the Haas Fund at that time was the Flexible Leadership Award, was a super powerful gift because there were a few restrictions, but mostly around like investing in the leader. And so to the point that Lysa was making earlier, like as being a new leader and getting an infusion of support to help you think and dream big was super helpful. And that gift helped us to do a lot of planning about what we, with partners across the state, thought was going to be really important in coming up. And the powerful thing about that was that these were not, right, there wasn't like a project-specific grant that we got to do some of the work that we were going to do, but we ended up leading along with 100 other organizations and nonprofits across the state what ended up being a multi-year initiative when Cal State was going to add an extra year of math as an entrance requirement and had not done the research to find out who that requirement might impact and what the disproportionate impacts might be. We were able to work with organizations across the state to ask those hard questions, to commission research, to make sure that students were at those state meetings when they were making those decisions, and eventually that requirement was not put into place. But none of that had been written into a project-specific grant, right? Like we had done that planning under the auspices of this broader kind of leadership funding that we received. And so, you know, just the power of one, investing in leadership, and then two, all that collaboration that was happening. I think one of the things that often gets lost is we often hear folks talk about like, oh, organizations need to collaborate more, they need to collaborate more. Well, that means that there is a human who needs to like run a meeting with several people in that meeting, right, who are like working on shared work, which is time, which means that is labor, which means those are funds that need to be expended, which may not necessarily be tied to a specific grant with that purpose. And so the power of having those funds can actually lead to real collective change. Those, you know, the piece around collaboration and the piece around investing in leadership really resonate with my own personal experience as well.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. And Phil, you've been with CEP researching philanthropic practice for 2 decades.
A little while.
Yeah, a little while. And you talked about some emerging changes that the data suggests. So can you put that into context for us? How significant is the change? And can you tell us why now? Is it pandemic related?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is significant. It's meaningful. For the better part of 2 decades, we, within the walls of CEP, lamented that we didn't see more change. And I'm not some kind of like reductionist absolutist who thinks there's no such thing as a thoughtful 1-year program grant. Like there's a time for that, you know, or that philanthropy foundations don't bring a lot of expertise to the table in a particular perspective. Of course they do. But the notion that we were stuck at like 2080 general support restricted grants, like that didn't make sense, right? In terms of organizations becoming stronger and being able to do the work and do things like collaborate, put money behind, you know, a plan that was already in place. And so we knew that, and this is gonna sound really parochial and I'm sorry, but it just happens to be true, that foundations that regularly did the grantee perception report on a 2 or 3 year interval, we saw change. They tended to give, for example, more general support over time. Why? You know, I think because if you hear the same complaint again and again, you start to understand it, and then you finally start to do something about it. Maybe just so you don't hear it anymore, I don't know. But, and then, you know, but we felt frustrated. You know, okay, that's good, that's something, but that's not change in the big universe. And then the pandemic hits, and I think that it isn't just the pandemic, right? It was years of advocacy by so many folks. So I think of organizations like NCRP that have been for years, you know, saying, look, organizations need to be supported differently. GEO, Bridgespan, with the nonprofit starvation cycle. Philanthropic leaders saying, like, nonprofits need something different. Nonprofit leaders taking the risk and saying, like, hey, even to deliver these programs, I gotta be strong organizationally. And so I think it was like the combination. And some of my staff really don't like this analogy for reasons I don't entirely understand, but I'm gonna use it anyway and they'll yell at me later, which is, it's kind of like if I was not, you know, eating well, and I was not exercising, and I was drinking too much, and all the people who care about me was sending me literature about, like, you know, get it together, Phil, read this research study. You know, I might ignore it until I survive the heart attack. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, the context has really shifted, and it really shifted for foundations, and I think they knew what they had to do in that moment, that they had to act differently. And I give folks a lot of credit for acting differently in that moment, and for the fact that a lot of the change we're seeing has been sustained. I do have questions about some change that I worry is not being sustained, but on the process side, streamlined processes, on the provision of general support, I think it's meaningful shifts.
That's great. I want to talk about trust because you brought it up, Jamie, and we've been reading about and thinking about and ideally practicing trust-based philanthropy, and it plays a big role in how MacKenzie Scott was giving and raises conversations. What is the role of trust in grant making? What would you like to offer, Lysa?
Oh gosh, where to start? I think it's so important. I want to build off some of the things that have been said that link to trust. And I just want to paint a picture on behalf of my organization and all of my peers, because all of this is reflected, like common experience in the research. Here's what happens when you trust. So Kaboom went from an organization that was very transactional, very binary. Foundations did not want to fund us because we could not prove our program impact. So in 2019, we had grown from like 98% of our funding coming from corporations to a little bit more of a diverse portfolio, where about 23% of our funding was coming from foundations. And yet that was about as far as we were going to get. We had about 2% coming from public entities. And we would have scraped along that path had someone not trusted us to rebuild our engine in a way that would be more impactful. So we moved from that scenario to where we are today is about, 44% of our funding is coming from foundations. About 13% is coming from public entities, so 2% to 13%, almost double the growth on the foundation side. And the work that we're doing is more aligned with what communities need. So we're building play spaces, we're building public infrastructure, and the kinds of projects we're doing, about 44% of them are what we call large scale. So historically we did this 2,200 square foot playground. Community's gonna tell us what they wanna see. Do you want a slider? Do you want to swing? That was it, you know? So within these parameters, here's how we'll respond to what you need. Now, about 44% of our work is large scale. And so now imagine moving beyond 2,200 square feet to a 10,000 square foot oasis, full of a nature play, full of outdoor classrooms, full of multi-sport courts, spaces for all ages, responding to exactly what the community wants to see. About 75% of that work is in places where we're making multi-year commitments. And talking about building partnerships, we had been so stuck in this way of working that we were going solo. We didn't have to, but we were going solo because you only have so many resources, and who has time to go and sit and talk with someone about ideating around all we can do when the budget that you have is focused on delivering against expectations of a funder that you want to renew year after year after year. And so now, because we were trusted, we were able to activate a way of working that has more impact on the communities we work in, where we're building places that are more aligned with what they need to see, not just this 2,200 square foot playground, which was fine, you know, in our past, but it's not fine right now. We are able to partner with other national nonprofits that some would call a competitor of ours, which is insane when we're trying to solve problems. But we're coming to the table with our so-called competitors who are also building public infrastructure to say, how can we get data to tell us what the scope of the problem is? And we go at it together. What resources do you have that complement mine? How can we buddy up on solving this problem? And then the last thing is the work that we're doing around public partnerships and really taking our private resources and putting that money and that commitment on the table to say, we need a match here. We've got to look at what is the city plan? What is the systems plan? What is the school plan? What is the parks plan? How do we all come together to pool our resources to help solve these problems based on the data that we have? So we're here now. Where we were was, okay, one funder, we're gonna build this project in East Atlanta, and we're gonna get it done in 6 weeks, and one day we're gonna build a playground in 6 hours, and ta-da, everybody's happy. But had we not been trusted with the resources to rip the Band-Aid off and say we've got to work in a different way, we would have never, ever been a nonprofit that is equipped to achieve its mission. We would have carried on just doing good work. And now we're synced up with peers. We're bringing others to the table. We're pushing the public systems to be aligned in a way that is focused on equity. And so that trust really matters. The partnership matters. And the other thing I'll say about MacKenzie Scott, and I know a lot of my peers had the same experience as you, is it wasn't just, you know, the phone call, here's $14 million, have fun. There was some due diligence on the front end. And so there was a filtering process. We had to outline what our budget had been, what was our largest gift, how are we not going to be dependent on one funder, so if we get this funding, what does that mean in terms of making sure that you don't come back for more, or you don't completely plummet because you were reliant on this one gift and now you're not getting it anymore. So there was some due diligence on the front end. It wasn't literally like the phone call, it was an interview, questions asked, and so there was some accountability, I think, to set us up for success. And then the last thing I'll say around the trust piece is I really appreciate that everybody was so honest in this report, because there is still the perception out there that nonprofits may not be capable of having the strategic foresight to be able to solve complex problems. There is also the perception out there that leaders of color or female leaders or anybody that's in a so-called minority population may not be equipped to solve these problems. And I love that people were honest enough to have this conversation and to be honest about their perceptions and their feelings, because that's what's gonna help us have conversations like this where it's like, hey, I'm a leader of color. I am well equipped. I was not put in this job because I'm a leader of color. I was put in this job because I have the experience, the passion, everything that is needed to solve this problem. But, thank you. Thank you. But it's true for me and it's true for my counterparts. The bonus that you get because I am a leader of color is that my lived experience helps me shortcut some of these answers. So if we are truly about trusting each other to solve the crazy problems that we inherited in this generation, then we will trust each other. We will start working each other. We will work out the kinks of these honest conversations, and we will start fixing some things. So trust is like foundational for everything that we need to do moving forward.
Thank you for that. One of the many interesting things you said was, one of my takeaways was funding cliff or no funding cliff, you are fundamentally operating differently as an organization, you're programming as an actor in the sector, and so that's sustainability right there. That's sustained impacts. That's incredible. I'm gonna ask 2 more questions, so please start thinking about any questions you might have, because we will take a couple here. And so I wanna know, Jamie, should we all just give this way, the way MacKenzie Scott has given, or is there a role for different types of grants? And of course, you maintain a portfolio that is the Endeavor Fund, plus other ways of giving. So tell us, what's the takeaway here?
I appreciate that question because I think that, any foundation, you think about the tools you have at your disposal. So a substantive 7-year grant is a tool, a project support grant is a tool, a $10,000 1-year grant is a tool. I think what's important is being thoughtful about matching the tool to the situation. I remember during COVID, for example, we were one of the foundations that took the pledge, and we're continuing to sustain many of the changes that we made during that time. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was to reduce administrative burden on our grantees. So we wanted to convert many of our project support grants to general operating support grants. We were accelerating grant payments on multi-year grants. And in some conversations with our nonprofit partners, when we talk to them about converting a project support grant to a general operating support grant, some of our grantees said no. Some of them said, actually, we want this to remain a project support grant because it ensures that this piece of work will happen and that the resources won't get diverted to some other line item in the budget. So again, at the fund, we think of the different tools that we have at our disposal. And I hasten to add that we think about our grant-making tools, but we also think about our human capital, like our staff as a tool. We think about our communications as a tool, that we have a lot of assets to bring to the change-making, change-enabling work that we do in the community, and that, yes, grant-making is a big part of it, but there are other tools that we have at our disposal in addition to grant-making as well.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Elisha, we have this natural experiment that CEP took up as a study opportunity. You're going to release year 2 data soon, but you're embarking on year 3 research. Simultaneously, what should we expect in year 3?
Yes, so year 3 is already started. It started last week, technically, although it's gonna take a little while to complete because there are 2 key things for year 3 that are gonna be really important. One is we're actually gonna be adding a component of looking at the 990 data from the organizations that received the gift to try and get a better idea of how finances have shifted over that time for organizations, and also have a comparative sample of organizations that are similar and see how things shifted there as well. And then the other piece that I think is gonna be really interesting, and probably a lot of folks in this room and elsewhere are really interested in, is, as many of you may know, this year, the way that MacKenzie Scott did her giving is different than the first 2 years, right? There is a website, there is an open call. And so in some ways, there are also going to be some very distinct learnings from that. And so we, as many others, I'm sure, around the world, are waiting for the announcement of those grantees in March of next year. And then we'll be following a very similar process and adding those grantees into the sample as well. And so super excited about sharing all those findings sometime in 2025.
Great. Thank you. So let's see if there are any questions out here. And I can't, of course, see. I think that's Emily right there who might have a microphone. If anybody on this side of the room has a question, please just stand up and Emily can bring you the mic. All right. How about anybody in this general area of the room? The middle? Okay. Okay, great. So there's, oh, perfect.
Hello. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating and interesting. My name is Sarah. Oh, hello. My name's Sarah from the Disability and Philanthropy Forum. And I was just curious, from a disability perspective, this type of giving is fundamental from an access perspective. If you are giving unrestricted funds to disabled-led organizations, it could be absolutely like freeing, because if you don't realize that the way that applications and deadlines are currently set up, it can be very prohibitive for disabled folks to have access to that type. So I'm just curious, in one of your slides it had, I think it said disability under health equity. So I'm just curious, in your research, if you had talked to any disabled-led organizations who received unrestricted fund, and if they had any insight as to how that funding was, how it altered sort of their perspective and how they were able to benefit from that. Because I just think, as a sort of message to all of you as well, like how life-changing this type of giving could be for disabled folks receiving that type of funding. Because the application and grant making could be so difficult in an access standpoint. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Just before we answer, can I just see a wave of who else might have a question so we can size up? Okay, right here and over there. Anybody else? Okay, a few. All right, so that helps us. We're going to try to be swift with our response. So we're going to go to Elisha and Phil, and then we'll let the mic folks just chime in.
I don't think I can answer that question in the sense that, without checking with our team, in the sense that in both year 1 and year 2, I don't know that we had enough critical mass of self-identified disabled leaders to analyze for differences. We can check with our colleagues. Elisha and I are looking at each other like, but it's a great question. I want to pick up on one thing that you mentioned that I think is more broadly applicable about just about time frames. I mean, you said a lot, and I agree that it's super powerful. One of the things that I think gets sort of under-discussed, and Elisha and I have talked about this a lot in the context of MacKenzie Scott's giving, and she alluded to it in her presentation, but the lack of a moment in time at which the money has to be spent, right? So this is why I think, it's my hypothesis, folks are not fearing the fiscal cliff, right? So in all my time leading CEP, I've never been on the receiving end, CEP has never been on the receiving end of a meaningfully sized gift or grant, whatever you want to call it, investment, whatever words you want to use, that was longer than 3 years. So, and we always felt, well, it needs to be spent by the time we go back again, right? And I get it, like, she's given one-time gifts, and that, there's issues, you know, you could have your worries about that. But I think that's, why aren't 7-year grants the default? Like, why are even multi-year grants 3 years, and then someone gets a big one, and then they staff up, and then boom, you know? So I feel like that has been sort of under-discussed, and I think it's so interesting what you've done, Jamie, because you picked a different number, and there's no reason why the default couldn't be that number, 7 years, for the organizations that are really core to your strategy.
Can I pick up on that just a little bit, or?
You can briefly, and then
Yeah.
we'll probably hear 2 questions at the, right after each other, and then see what you guys might offer, because we're going to run out of time.
I'll go quick. I love that you lift that up, Phil, because on the nonprofit side, it's darn near impossible to plan future years when you know, I got to come back, I got to get my report, I got to submit this and that. And so we were able to create a 3-year plan. You know, of course, we had the option of do we want to digest this all? I think the report said like only 9% of the nonprofits spent down the money right away, probably because they needed it. But for most of us, having that funding, the knowledge of funding in the years ahead allowed us to say, here's where we need to be in 5 years. Here's how we're going to invest in ourselves in year 1. Here's how we're going to build on that foundation in year 2. Here's what year 4 looks like. And not being able to do that is paralyzing at times, because so much of our energy goes into, we're going to get through this year and we're going to be conservative about what we do, because what happens next year when we come back and the program officer has changed, or the priorities have changed, or there's a new strategic revision, and now, oh great, okay, well good thing we didn't plan for that, because now we don't have the resources to continue that work. And so I think that's a really important point. I just wanted to put an emphasis from the nonprofit side on just how important it is to create impact by having the knowledge of long-term commitments.
Amazing. We have about 5 minutes, so we'll take a succinct version of whatever couple questions are out there. And our mic runners are doing their thing. Great.
All right, I'm going to talk really fast so I can be succinct. How about that?
Succinct, not fast. How's that?
Lysa, first of all, thank you for the courageous and bold leadership in the community. Jamie, thank you for leading the way with a 7-year trajectory for the systemic changes we need. Jacqueline Martinez with the Latino Community Foundation. Phil, great to see you again. It's a comment tied to a very specific question about the process that MacKenzie Scott has been using. So with the Supreme Court justice decision, a lot of funders are a little nervous about investing in Black-led, Latino-led, Indigenous-led organizations because of what the implications may be in the future. What MacKenzie Scott has done, which is kind of intentional because it's a gift of contribution, here the word matters, Phil, but this is really important as we move into the future. Foundations that care about equity are all of a sudden starting to take that information off their website and doing less investments in Black-led, Latino-led, Indigenous-led. However, if we do this the way MacKenzie Scott has done this, removing the grant agreement that is signed, foundations that care about Black-led, Latino-led, Indigenous-led organizations are protected under the First Amendment in order for them to give gifts and contributions to these organizations to keep doing the incredible work of equity. So Jamie, my question is for you, and also the question for CEP in terms of the questions that you are asking. Are we seeing, and Jamie, are you thinking about removing the grant? I mean, this is like trust-based philanthropy 2.0. This idea of program officers having done due diligence, there's a proposal submitted, it's an agreement. And in the business world, it works with a handshake. Here's a grant award letter that's not countersigned, but it's an award letter that says you're gonna do this, and you submitted a proposal, and we're gonna trust you to do that work without having you sign a contract that all of a sudden may put foundations at risk of being countersued for investing in Black-led and Latino-led, Indigenous-led organization. I'm trying to be very, MALDEF is leading this effort to educate foundations on how to do more of this work without being at risk. So I just would love to hear the thoughts on this question.
Okay. Before you answer, I'm gonna dig one more question. That was not succinct, but I liked it a lot. We're gonna take another question, and then I'm gonna ask you to fold your answers into your concluding remarks. We gotta wait, you've got the mic, okay, good.
Thank you. Succinctly as I can put it, first of all, fabulous panel, so thank you so much. My first CEP conference, if they're all like this, we are rolling. Heard the research, heard some of the underpinnings, the very transparent underpinnings of how people feel. What do we do about that?
That's a great question. So I'm gonna give, thank you for that. I'm gonna give each of you a chance to give your parting wisdom for the audience and incorporate responses to those great questions. And I'm sorry we don't have time for more, but we will be around for the next few days. So can we start, we'll start with Jamie.
The Walter and Elise Haas Fund is fully committed to strengthening its commitment to race equity, gender equity. We are not scrubbing our website of words that might put our work under scrutiny. You know, the North Star of closing the racial and gender wealth gap, which is the North Star for the Endeavor Fund, that is not
changing. We recognize that we're in an environment where philanthropy and other actors might pull back on their commitments to equity. One of the benefits of working in philanthropy, and particularly in an endowed foundation that has insurance, if someone wants to come for us, and though I am not inviting it by any stretch of the imagination, but if you want to fight with us about it, let's fight. Like, we have a vision of the kind of world we want to live in and the kind of world that we're going to create. We're not going to back down from that because some people who don't care about us as much as we care about us said no.
Thank you. Parting wisdom, Lisa?
I told you we could talk about this for 3 days. I just would say, thank you for saying that. And I think, like, we're the ones, right? Like, if not us, who? And so as we think about the contributions that we want to make with our time, which is finite, let's be bold and let's share and let's be honest. We've stubbed our toes and made a lot of mistakes. I'm happy to share any of that with anybody, but I think my parting words would just really be around, let's continue this conversation. I'm glad this study is for 3 years and that we will have multiple places to continue to have a dialogue and be really honest, but we have to be the ones. I'm at an organization that is solely focused on creating vibrant communities, happy, healthy kids, because what we know for sure is that those kids are going to end up leading us. And so we have to be the ones to solve these problems. And so let's be bold and courageous and not shy away from the hard conversations and really start to foster the kind of partnerships and collaboration that it takes to solve problems, not just one problem, but all of our collective issues that we're focused on.
Thank you. Elisha?
Well, I was going to say be courageous, but Lisa took that, so I won't repeat it, but I will +1 that one. But one thing I think that we should definitely be doing, that came up explicitly in some of those slides, is we should continue to have the hard conversations, right? Like, we don't necessarily all agree or have to agree, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have a conversation about it, and that's the start of change. And we're at a moment where that actually is a big statement, right? Like, having the hard conversation. I think that's super important. And then number 2 is, I think something super explicit that we should name and try and do more is to invest in new leaders. The experience that Lisa described as a new leader, I had that same experience my first year, and we both ran organizations and almost doubled their operating budgets. But that took somebody to trust in what the power was of what that vision could be and the team that we had. And so I think that's one of those concerns that came up several times in those slides, and it's one of the things that I hope we can continue to have continued conversations around too.
Great advice.
The only thing I would say is, in response to the last question there, I mean, I was thinking about what I often do. I often do this shtick where I get up and start talking about all the negative stereotypes about nonprofits. And then I talk about, like, how much that pisses me off because of all of the amazing heroic work that so many nonprofits do. I'm not sure that actually works that well. And I think what Jamie offered up is a real, like, case study in leadership, engaging patiently her board members and saying, I want to understand, where is that coming from? And let's work through it together. It probably takes both. I mean, it takes some bluntness about questioning the assumptions that we walk in to conversations about organizations with, but it also takes patience and thoughtful engagement and a change process along the lines of, I think, what Jamie has done, which is really amazing.
Well, I'm really grateful to each of you for the leadership role you're playing in your organizations and in the sector, and for your contributions to this panel. So thank you all so much.